Hello, everybody, and welcome to the live stream where you're joined by myself, Dr. Yusuf, and Dr. Keith, as we're going to talk about how we can use technology in general practice and make it safe for you to use in terms of particularly with governance and CQC and various other things as we tech enhance your primary care and learning. Let's get cracking, shall we? Hello, EGP learners and everybody else out there in general practice land and various other places that are joining us for this unique LinkedIn and YouTube live that we've got going out to various different platforms. I hope you're all set for a really interesting session. I'm joined here today by a couple of guests, which we're going to go to in a second, as we talk about tech in primary care and particularly making sure that you are CQC ready, which are those three less acronyms that most people sometimes stress about, but we're going to make sure you don't have to stress about it by the end of this live stream. So don't worry about that. I'm going to go first to our guests we've got. So how are we doing there, Yusuf?
Yeah, thanks, Zane. Doing good. Thanks for having me.
No problems. Do you want to introduce yourself to everybody on EGP Learning and other places that we've got?
Yeah, so hi, everybody. I'm Yusuf. I'm a public health consultant, and I'm head of safety at Curistica. So Keith and I have been working together for coming up to 2 years now, I think, Keith.
Yeah.
All things data, all things health tech, especially looking at things like compliance, data protection, cybersecurity, and clinical safety too. So our passion is we love tech. We like it. We especially like tech in healthcare, but we're also very passionate about patient safety and making sure it's used in the right way.
Definitely. And I'm going to pass over now to Keith. So some of the EGP learners may remember Keith from various live streams that we've done before. Hopefully no introduction, but I'm going to let you give it a chance, Keith. Why don't you say hi to everybody?
Thanks, folks. Hi, I'm Keith. I am a former GP. I worked as a GP from 2000 to 2024. I no longer practice, but don't worry, folks, I'm still GMC registered because I'm a specialist in digital health and AI. And yeah, I love technology, much as Yusuf does. This is why we get on so well. And I really want to see technology deployed in practice, but I also happen to be a doctor, and I will do my best to make sure it doesn't cause any unsafe practice. So I founded Curistica just over 2 years ago, and the aim of that was to make safety easier for people building the technology, manufacturers, or buying and deploying it, you people using it as well. So yeah, this is what we do with clinical safety and data protection and much, much more.
Yeah. And throughout this, we're going to go through those different aspects. So in particular, we're going to talk about clinical safety, we're going to talk about data protection, cybersecurity, and various other things that have an impact in terms of how you use a lot of the technology products in primary care. And like we said, how to make that safe and effective for you to use. Because that's the most common thing I get people stressing about. You know, I've gone to do loads of talks recently, and the common thing everyone's asking, how do we know it's safe and how can we use these products safely in general practice with our patients? Because the governance is clear but not clear. Is that probably a good way of describing it?
Yeah, I think that's a good way of putting it.
Cool. So let's get cracking. And I guess one of the things probably worth clarifying then, Keith, is that, you know, people talk about technological products. We're not just talking AI though, are we?
No, but AI is very much the flavor of the day. And it's funny as you sort of talk about that and how people are coming to you, and they come to me and Yusuf as well, and they sort of say, oh, how can I be sure it's safe and so on. So there's kind of two reasons for that. Number one, AI feels very new and mysterious and potentially a little bit untrustworthy. And so I think because of the general perception of this, people's antennae are up regardless. And most people will have an awareness that AI isn't perfect and it can have some problems, which we might go into, like hallucinations and bias. And so they already sort of know this. And so it's natural that they would think about this, about AI coming into practice. And there's a lot of pressure and desire to bring it in to help out. So that's part of it. But the interesting thing is that people are asking now this question. I'm interested in why weren't they asking it before? Because we've been using technology, not just AI, for a long time now. And a lot of the things that we're going to be discussing today, the important takeaway is that it also applies to the other technology that you're using with your patient care, everything from the electronic health record through to some of the things you might not think about. So something has changed, and we might go into why that was. But I think that's why it's on people's minds just now.
Okay. And I guess in particular with AI, I mean, there's various different products and things that people are coming across. Where should people start?
Yeah, well, Where do you start with all of this? I suppose the first thing is whenever you're putting any technology into your practice, the first thing that you want to be clear about is, well, what problem am I trying to solve? What is it I'm trying to do? Always sort of start with the needs of your patients, the people you serve, the people who serve them, your practice, and the business needs of your practice as well. You should always start that way. But it's difficult because what happens is either technology is provided for you and there's a directive to use it. So here comes a solution, you need to put this in. And broadly speaking, it will solve a problem that you have. I'll say electronic health records are a maybe good example of that, provided and procured elsewhere and then deployed in front of you. But then you have technologies like ambient voice technology or scribes, and we'll probably come back to those quite a lot in this. And what happens there is that this novel technology that helps transcribe what's happening inside the consultation room and create notes, enabled by changes in artificial intelligence and delivering something that's very, very easy to see what difference it makes, is suddenly popping up in your socials and you're being aware of it, or other people start using it, or it's being marketed. And all of a sudden you see something that obviously seems to solve maybe one of the problems that you're having. Everyone's feeling frazzled. You're really busy writing these things down, notes down, you can't connect with the patients and so on. And so often, the technologies that you're having to deal with immediately in front of you come from that. It suddenly bursts into your awareness. And then you've got this general sense of FOMO that other people are charging ahead with AI and you're not. And without knowing it, all of a sudden people in the practice are using ambient voice technology as browser plugins or on their phone, and you don't know what's going on.
Definitely agree with that. And Yusuf, from your perspective, what kind of problems have you come across that people are identifying when it comes to using tech, particularly in primary care, and your thoughts on it?
Yeah, so I think building on what Keith said, I think the biggest problem is people just don't know how many of the technologies that they have currently, which regulations apply to them. So one of the first things we asked was, what is the size of your problem? Do you know how many digital health technologies that you've deployed in your practice actually need these compliance standards applied to them? So we're talking clinical safety, adequate DPIAs or privacy notices, or cybersecurity certificates. So it's working with practices to kind of figure out, okay, this technology you've been using for the last 5 years, what do you think about it? Do you know if it applies? How does it work? How does it impact patient care? Because if it does, then we need to look at the next step of, do you have the right sort of compliance certificates for it? And one of the things I always say when practices speak to me is, I ask them, okay, I'm going to be a CQC inspector. My first question is, how many digital health technologies are you using? Do you have an answer? Can you tell me? And the second question is, okay, of those, how many have clinical safety certificates? How many have an 0129? How many have an 0160? And if you can't tell me, that's something that you need to address very quickly. And then I can go on, have you looked at your DPIAs recently? Do your privacy notices reflect the DPIAs you have? Are your users, are your patients aware of how data is being transferred? And although it's not something that practices need to deal with specifically, have you checked that the cybersecurity certificates, Cybersecurity Essential, Cybersecurity Plus, of the manufacturers that you use are valid? What is the latest results of their penetration testing, for example? So these are all things that a practice needs to have awareness of, but may not necessarily fall under their remit to fix. But a lot of it still does. And I think that's what we're there for, is to help practices identify what the problem is in a very systematic way, and then help them address those problems in a way that's pragmatic and effective. Because we all work in the NHS, we know that money is tight. At local authority where I work, it's very tight. It will be for primary care as well. So the key thing that we take a very risk-based, pragmatic approach. What are the things that cause the most harm? Let's address those first, and then at least have a plan for the rest of the stuff as well. And then we can address those later down the line. And, having been a CQC inspector before, as long as there is a plan for how you're going to address something that you've identified, it's basically okay. As long as you've said, this is my plan, this is how I'm going to do it, the inspectors are going to be, they're going to be like, okay, fine. At least it's not a blind spot. You've identified it. You've got a plan in place. So let's move on to something else.
Cool.
Yeah. You heard it here first, folks.
Which is true with most of CQC's inspection processes. As long as, if you have a problem, as long as you've got a plan to address the problem and try and fix it, that's most of what they're asking for, as long as it's not something that's so critical that actually puts you as a safety risk. So definitely agree with that. So we've had a couple of comments, and welcome to add more comments for those who are joining us live. So one from Stella: it's interesting that people's awareness of technology in healthcare has only recently become acute after decades of publicity about IT initiatives. I think that's definitely a valid comment. We have got a couple more. I'm going to say to Lee, who's left a massive one. I'm afraid it's too big for me to bring on and read out because it's going to take up the whole screen. So Lee, if you want to submit that again in a shorter version, have to try and stick that on in some way. But I guess one of the things that Yusuf mentioned was this concept of the CSO role. And if I can, I'm going to go to that one first, because it's the second most requested thing I get asked about whenever I've gone to speak to people in primary care. So how about you both, and happy whichever whoever wants to take this, explain to us in brief, what is the CSO role and how much responsibility does it actually have? Let's start with that.
I don't know. Yusuf, you're on a roll. You want to take this, or shall I pick up here?
Go for it. I'll jump in later.
All right. Yeah. You correct me if I drift. Okay. CSO, clinical safety officer. A clinical safety officer is a registered medical professional. So it could be a doctor, it could be a nurse, it could be a pharmacist. They don't need to be practicing clinically at the moment, but they need to be registered. So that's part one. The second thing they need to be trained in clinical risk management, because what does a clinical safety officer do? A clinical safety officer is responsible and accountable for clinical risk management, identifying problems with clinical risk and what steps are being taken to reduce those risks, and making sure that that's done. And they do that when you take a new technology and before you even put it out, you want to check to make sure that the manufacturer's done their side of the work. Then you have to think about deploying it in the practice or the trust or wherever you're putting it to make sure that it's going to be safe to deploy there. And then you need to keep an eye on it while it's running in the sort of day-to-day life of it, responding to any incidents or issues along the way and seeing whether those thoughts that you had at the start about its safety still hold up in reality. The products will change, so you need to make sure that these new features that come down the line aren't doing something strange to the safety profile. And then at some point you might think, I don't want this product anymore, I want to go to something else, or the product might come off the market, and you have to do that. You can't just turn the thing off, you have to plan it a little bit. So a CSO is a person who understands about risk management and the important standards that are in place, and we may come back to those, and help step through those and create the necessary evidence along the way. But it's all about safety with digital health technologies being deployed in either from a legal basis in an NHS setting in England or in adult social care. And that's been the case, folks, since 2012. And you may be wondering, why on earth didn't I find out about this beforehand? Actually, the question that was asked a minute ago probably says, we've been talking about this for a long time. Why haven't people been thinking about it? We can come back to that maybe. We know about it now, and so it's a good opportunity to start working on it.
Okay, so I'm going to ask a slightly different question then, because I get asked this loads. How much CSO cover does a practice need?
Well, yeah. I can maybe I'll have a wee tilt at that, and then Yusuf, we don't exactly know, in truth. It's not specified in the standard that every practice needs a full-time CSO beavering away on this all the time, although there's going to be a bit of a backlog to work through. But what you absolutely need is a CSO that's going to be responsible or accountable for a practice. Now, that could be a person performing that role across a number of practices, and they don't necessarily need to be a full-time CSO either, but you could have that. And in fact, predating all of this, and actually part of the reason that we're here is that ICBs actually were discharging a lot of this function when they procured things centrally. They would have CSOs and teams doing this work as well. So maybe that's why you were less aware of it at the time. But as ICBs go through their changes and as new technologies are procured by practices directly more often, that's why it started to shift back. So anyway, do you need one per practice? No, but you might actually have a person in your practice that wants to do this as part of their fractional role. They do the rest of the work and they want to do this, and the keen bean techie ones are generally the ones that step forward on this. So you might solve it that way. But more typically, what you might want to do, and more efficiently, is have a CSO that works across a number of practices, and that could be a PCN or a less formal sort of mix of them. The reason that what you need this to do to work, though, is that the setting has to be reasonably similar as well. If you have lots of extremely different practices, the work of a CSO is going to get much harder, because the CSO is going to have to say, is this technology, as it's been delivered, going to work in practice A, practice B, practice C, practice D? And if they're all doing things very, very differently, you can imagine there's going to be a lot of work to reconcile it. But if you've got practices that are broadly similar, then it becomes much easier.
Mm-hmm. Any additional points on that, Yusuf?
Yeah, I mean, I think what I would do is akin to a DPO role, right? You don't need a DPO to sit in the practice every day to answer questions. But when you need the DPO, you need them quickly and you need them to act with experience. Yeah. And I have this conversation with practices a lot. We say, do you have a CSO? They say, oh, no, we don't. So, okay, well, we can do, for example, in the DCBO 160, but it's not, compliance doesn't just end at that. You need someone to continuously be with you, because, it might just be as little as 2 hours a month. It might be more than that. But the point is that when a clinical safety incident occurs, and it will occur, it's not a question of, if, it's a question of when, you need that person to be there to say, right, this is how we're going to deal with it. This is what we're going to do as a result of it. It's how we're going to change our practice going forward so it doesn't happen again. So you have that incident logged and managed accordingly. Whilst unlike the DPO role, there is no fine for a breach, there is a risk of significant patient harm in some instances. And you just need someone to be able to look at that objectively, use it with experience and say, this is fine or this isn't. The first stage of any sort of safety incident with tech is a CSO looking at going, there is no harm here, or there is harm here, now do something about it. And if you don't have a CSO, you can't do that. But if you have an inexperienced CSO, that just becomes much harder. And we often, it's something that actually Keith and I, we talk about in the paper we've published, that I've seen someone in the comments talk about as well, is that, CSO experience, both digital experience doing the safety checks, but also clinical experience, years of practice, really good indicators of how they can produce quality clinical safety case reports and hazard logs. So, we know there's a lot of interest in being a CSO, but actually being a CSO doesn't end at the end of the training. That's where your journey begins.
Yeah. And I'm going to move off the CSO role in a second. I'm just going to ask one more point on that, but we had an excellent question from CSO about the CSO cover from Stella come through. So I know one of the things I've said to practices is that my estimation would be, if you're roughly about 15 to 20,000 patient practice footprint and moderately involved in digital transformation, you're probably going to need about a session of GP or CSO cover per week in order to start and maintain it. Does that sound about right to both of you?
That does sound pretty good, actually. And actually, you've nailed explaining it better than I did, because I start talking about hours, but I've drifted away from the front line a little bit. So yeah, I mean, session, the time. I think if you had that, I think that would certainly work for. There'd be efficiencies about how it's done. When we work, we might be able to get these things done faster and smoother and so on, but we do this all the time. But I think that would work quite well as part of an administrative role. And if you talk about that, you could then say, well, you could actually have a person working 4 sessions, over a sort of rough size of a PCN or something like that, and they could probably discharge some of it. And, they definitely get to a point where they were, as they grow in their capabilities, they'll be able to take on more of that. The other thing, of course, is that being a CSO can sometimes traditionally be quite a lonely thing. You're the one person and you're sort of stuck and making all these decisions. But increasingly, CSOs are connecting and there's more communities of practice. And so what I see working very well, and this is once you get to sort of PCN plus and larger collections of primary care services or other services, is a network of CSOs maybe working in that way that communicate with each other. Because what then happens is that you can kind of divide and conquer on some of the common work. You can share your learning and actually share some of those difficult questions, things that we provide in terms of support, but also people can support each other too. So I think that's the kind of direction of travel, hopefully, that we go here.
Definitely agree on that community of practice as well that you mentioned. So news update for everyone else. I officially became a CSO yesterday because I had my training update and all that kind of
Congratulations.
stuff. And a shout out to Nick and Ian, a couple of the others who had joined me on the course yesterday. They may actually be watching, so I did say I was going to do this. So yeah, but you're right. It's understanding, I guess, the depth of work and that it ebbs and flows. And the thing I liken it to many in general practice to is it's like your safeguarding lead. It's one of those things that depending on how much workload you've got from that will change on what you need to do. It's a responsible role to make sure that things work effectively, but that doesn't mean it's their responsibility to do everything, because everybody else has a responsibility to make sure it still works in the background. It's just their role to make sure that things are kind of going in the right direction.
Yeah, and I'm going to come in at this point because I think you've just said something that's really, really important. Clinical safety, data protection, security are not someone else's job. Everyone has a part to play in this. Now, that doesn't mean that everyone has to be a CSO or a DPO or everything like that, but it's a little bit like just any clinical governance, or if you're prescribing, it's the same thing. You'll understand a little bit about the process. You'll understand about maintaining your own skills and competence, and about monitoring your own practice from a clinical service perspective. And then if things go wrong, you know how to identify them and how to address them and investigate them and so on. Same with prescribing, same with everything else. The lovely news here is it's the same with technology. Okay, it's the same thing. You're using these tools in your practice. You want to make sure that you use them in the right way. You use them competently. You can see when they go wrong. You know what to do about it. And you have an idea about how to participate in looking at what went wrong and how it could change it again. I think that sadly, we have neglected to teach people at undergraduate and postgraduate level about some of the basics of this for too long. And we've got work to do there. So it may feel alien, but the heart of it is still the same. And again, to reassure people, this is all extremely manageable about this, about how to do this. But part of it is configuring how you do the work to make sure it goes on. It's not someone else's problem. Everyone has a part to play, big or small. I think as we go through this, because we're all interested in AI, and then start to expand it out, the quality of what we're doing, the safety of what we're doing rises. And what does that mean for you as a practice and your patients? Well, it means less things going wrong, number one, and patient harm. And of course, that's critically important, but also less frazzle for your staff. It means you get less complaints, you'll get less remedial work from the CQC or other people. You'll feel more in control of what's going out there. And over time, you're going to be much better informed about how to pick the tools to help you fix the things that are important to you. That comes along the way too. So there's loads of benefits.
Cool. Okay, so we've got loads of comments and questions coming still in, but we're going to just change tack slightly. So we were talking about clinical safety. So tell me your perspectives of clinical safety. What does that mean? And what do people need to know before we go on to other things and then go back to the questions?
Yeah, well, Yusuf, go for it. You come in here.
Yeah, clinical safety, in essence, is something we've been doing for decades, right? We always strive to, any clinical pathway we have is to make sure that it doesn't cause harm. It's a predictable harm. Some healthcare, there is inevitably going to be harm somewhere. That's just the nature of healthcare. But it's mitigating that, identifying it, assessing it, and mitigating that risk in a very structured approach. Your aim is to say, for a manufacturer, by the time that I've released this product on the market, I have gone through a process where I've looked at it, seen how it's being used, looked at how it can go wrong, and then put in controls to stop those things happening. Some of those controls are within my gift as a manufacturer to do. Some of them I have to rely on whoever buys it, whoever uses it to do as well. And then as a deploying organization, so GP practice, NHS trust, social care provider, whoever it is, and just be clear, this applies to anyone that's delivering health or social care in a publicly funded setting. They have a responsibility to do the same process, really, but to say, based on how we use it, what are the risks that may arise? So typically in a GP practice, it may be the interface points between different levels of technology. So in AVTs, for example, we see an often hazard that comes up is the copying process from an unintegrated AVT into the patient EPR records. That is a hazard because of the ways it can go wrong. Or, for example, if you have a population that has a high proportion of people who speak a different language, or perhaps a very strong accent, then the ABT may not pick it up properly. For example, these are the examples of hazards. So this is where I think it's important to go back to the clinical safety officer, because a good clinical safety officer will have enough experience both in assessing technologies, but also in how they're used on the front line to be able to know exactly where these things can go wrong and think outside of the box, think more holistically. So when Keith and I look at clinical safety cases, we also include things like equity. We look at access. We look at how it interacts with data protection, because that approach where the sum is greater than the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, and they're synergistic. We kind of say if you get the data protection part right, the clinical safety part also is stronger, and vice versa. So that's, I've seen some of the questions Shahid wrote about, acceptable levels of errors in AI models. Again, that's sort of answered with a clinical safety case. Because you say, look, we know there will be errors. It's all about how you deal with those errors. And that is the essence of clinical safety, is accepting there will be risk and being able to think about how you're going to mitigate those risks. Keith?
We've got a primary care audience here as well, and I know I can say confidently to everyone on this call, what is our work if not balancing risk every single day, every single consultation? It's always a sort of, well, these are the good things, these are the bad things. Often it's like, which is the least bad thing in front of us? So you're all in some way a master of balancing risks, honed over many years of practice and training and so on. And with technology, some of this, particularly the mechanism of where the problems come from, are sometimes a little bit opaque and difficult and tricky to work through. So if we, like Yusuf was just saying there, one of these things, let's talk about maybe the copy and paste is a good example. What you want is the scribe records the conversation, transcribes it, creates a summary, and then that's in a box on the screen, and you have to get it from that box into the electronic health record. Now, all of the manufacturers are working very hard, and some have successfully got this integrated into the record, which is great. But until that point happens, how do you get it across? Highlight it, copy it, and paste it. Okay, so what can go wrong in there, and how likely is it? Okay, what can go wrong? I don't copy it and paste something else. I paste it into the wrong person's notes. I only paste part of it. I paste it into the wrong part of the notes. So all these things can happen.
Or it doesn't copy and you paste the previous one that you did as a result of it.
Yeah. Or you've got multiple tabs open, and or you've got a family and there's like, mum and two kids in there, and you've got the wrong bit. So that's the practical bit. How can that go wrong? And you can say, oh yes, but doctors and nurses are terribly careful and that will never happen. And then we think about what it's like to be in a consulting room and people bouncing up and down and shouting and pressure and everything. So this stuff does happen, and I know it does happen. And what happens when you paste it into the wrong place, you can catch it at the right time and fix it. That's grand, you can stop it doing that. But if that gets put into the notes and then afterwards you have to go back and fix it. But what if it goes in there and you don't realize? And then the first you hear about it is a patient saying, hang on a second, I looked in my notes today and there was something I didn't recognize. Not only have you peeved that person, they're upset that this has happened, but you've also got a data breach on there as well, and the complaint, and all of a sudden you've got a lot of work to work through this, and also you've got what is often cutely termed like minor psychological harm, but of course the person that experiences that, it can be really distressing. So you have to combine those two. It doesn't mean that you can't use this. It means that you have to understand the risks and go slow when you need to go slow, and then pick up when the road is clear.
Okay. So we talked about risk, we talked about clinical safety. Let's shift tack a little bit. So, the integrity of the data, that side of things is also a factor. So cybersecurity in particular, you briefly mentioned some of this in terms of penetration testing and stuff, but, explain cybersecurity for dummies in primary care, because that's probably a good place to start. And also I'm going to come to the second question on cybersecurity in a second, but yeah, let's go with that one first.
Yeah, so it's probably worth pointing out that Keith and I, while we have insight into cybersecurity, it's not our day-to-day thing, okay? Sure. But we know enough to say Well, the biggest onus on primary care is to, whenever you procure one of these technologies, is to check the cybersecurity is in place. Check that they've got, and the DTAC is really good for this, right? So the DTAC is digital technology assessment criteria, and it essentially lays out what you have to go through to make sure that something is, suitable for deployment in a health and social care setting. And it's things like making sure that certificates are up to date, they're valid, what were the results of their testing, if any issues were found out, how do they address it? And then the next part is that, how does it integrate with your work? Now, similar to data protection, one of the principles I hold to is the weak point is often the human. It's not usually the technology. With cybersecurity, with data protection, the more people you have interacting with it, the higher the failure rates become. So, people always say, oh, we got to make sure that this is in place. This side, we have this certificate, or, we've done the penetration testing. But often I flip that back and say, well, just how many people do you have? Are they all aware of, for example, the phishing scams out there? Do they all have adequately strong passwords? Two-factor authentication setup? Do you have role-based access control? All this kind of stuff. That's really the essentials of cybersecurity, and it maps across to everywhere else as well. Keith, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think just a couple of things. You talked about penetration testing there as well. We're maybe using some terms that people are less sure of. I shared in the private chat might come out about DTAC as well. Penetration testing is essentially when a company or an organization will essentially have a go at the security defenses in a structured way, and the common sort of points of failure. And what you're hoping for when a penetration test is done is that there'll always be a degree of some weaknesses, but it has to sort of cross a certain threshold as well of the common ideas. So basically, it's about your system's resilience to being hacked and poked at. And if anyone says, well, how often does this happen? Well, it's happening a lot more these days. You just have to look at what happened yesterday around the world because a provider of services called Cloudflare went down for a short period of time. Doesn't appear to have been a cyber attack in this instance, but you can see the consequences of that. Mm-hmm. But you can also see the consequences of a cybersecurity incident. What happened at Guy's and St. Thomas's back in 2024, I think it was, when one of the lab systems was compromised, and there's a cascade of problems. There was a ransomware attack which took the clinical service offline, particularly some functions, for a while. And other than being monstrously disruptive to everyone, it led to patient harm. And we're only now finding out how much patient harm it came to, including a recent coroner's inquest that identified one patient death that was a direct consequence of the fallout of this happening, at least 2 cases of serious harm, countless practices potentially still affected by things that are happening there. So, there's a lot going on here, and the manufacturers will very frequently, and they can be very good about this, get their testing done. There are certain bits of evidence that they have to provide, and DTAC, that form, helps them provide it.
Okay, well, leads me on to my next question then. So do you think practices, and there's different footprints we can talk about with that part, do they need to think about their own cybersecurity's insurance policies as a result of what's currently going on with digital use in primary care?
Interesting question. I don't know, Yusuf, what do you reckon? You're a PM in front of you who's anxious about this. And I'll be clear, we're not selling cyber insurance or anything like that. So, but yeah, Yusuf, should I get cyber insurance?
I mean, probably, I guess. I put me on the spot here.
Well, let me put it a different way. Given the fact that the premiums potentially go from anywhere from thousands to thousands to hundreds of thousands of pounds as well, so it does come caveat depending on your size. Also, those premiums can be astronomical.
I mean, listen. I think it's one of those things where when you need it, you'd be glad to have had it, but until that pain comes, you don't know. And honestly, I can hold my hands up honestly and say I have no idea, right?
No, fair enough.
But it just feels to me that we're seeing more and more of this. Thankfully, and I say this with knowing full well I have complete information asymmetry because a lot of this may be hidden from public view. We haven't seen the extent of cybersecurity incidents in healthcare as we have possibly in other areas, but it might just be a matter of time. You may have experienced cybersecurity issues and they've been hidden. I think, there's various ways that cyber criminals can take advantage of this stuff. It may be very maliciously by changing stuff in records, or it may be very overt, like locking you out. and doing some malware attacks and such. So I guess just like any other insurance, it's a balancing act with a practice, right? It's what is the risk of your services going down if something like this happens? What is the harm that can arise for it, or the financial penalties and whatnot, compared to the cost of getting the insurance in the first place? And that is for individual practices to assess themselves.
Yeah, and in the unfair hospital pass that I threw to Yusuf there, well, I bought myself some time to think about how to answer this myself, because I did, it depends on what your premiums and everything are, but if we just, the costs of it have come down. There's potentially some sense in this, and actually we do speak to insurers, along the way to understand their, what they're doing things. And other organizations will often provide the software and infrastructure for you that might be handling this. But let's sort of step away from an insurance policy and think about what insurance can you put in place. And the insurance that you can put in place without paying for a policy is making sure that your staff understand how to manage things safely, that they don't just flick through, the mandatory training at the end. And there are some aspects about it that they do keep their passwords securely stored, that they have two-factor authentication, that you're very careful about that. That's your insurance policy within there, to making sure that the software is up to date, that no one's installing funny products, apps, and extensions that might go into the practice. All of those things will reduce the risk, which is a form of insurance within there as well. So I think that's that's the practical thing that you can do here as well. Just make sure that people aren't sticking passwords up on a sticky note somewhere or anything, and being careful about that. That's the practical advice, I'd say.
Okay, so data security, good IG principles, all that kind of stuff. Absolutely, that's good stuff to protect you now. Okay, so we've got quite a few questions coming through. Before we go to those questions, guys, so from each of you, your top 2 tips that people can do right now to reduce their clinical safety risk from a digital perspective. I'm going to give Yusuf the opportunity to be easier, because he gets to go first, because then Keith can't obviously replicate it. So
all right, okay.
Yusuf.
Here we go.
All right, go for it, Yusuf.
My only piece of advice is do an audit. Just identify what you have, and you'll be surprised at what falls within the definitions. Look at the definitions on the DCB 129 website. Helpfully, NHS Digital have updated that recently to be very clear flowchart. Use it and identify how many products you have that fit the bill, and then just work through and say, do I have everything that's in the D tag for all of these? And remember, this applies to everything you're using. It doesn't matter if you've been using it for 20 years. What's important is now, is it compliant, yes or no? So my top tip advice is just look to see how many you have, and then obviously check if you have a CSO or not.
Yeah. Okay. Right, okay. Well, that is the super top tip in there as well. Yeah, first of all, understand the scale of the problem that you're facing. Yeah, we can help you with that. But there's things, just working out what they are. And who bought them for you is the other bit too. But if I'm sort of talking about practical as well, I'm going to talk about this. So AVT is a good example. The Scribes is a good example, because there's people merrily using it as a browser extension or on their phone before it's been formally signed into place. And regardless of what you as a practice manager or a senior person in the practice might be asking, people might still wheedle their way around it. So as you're working the rest of it out, my advice would be, number one, make sure that people have looked at the training for these products. It's not they're very easy to use. That's one of the attractive things about them, but it's still worthwhile reading what they provide. The manufacturers provide great stuff on this, and it's not long-winded, because it explains how it works, and importantly, how it should be used, how it might go wrong, and what to do about it if it goes wrong. So number one, read the manual. The second one is, if you're using a Scribe in particular, check what comes out of it. Don't wave it through. Check what comes out of it, because Scribes actually do a better job than humans in transcribing and summarizing. They make slightly different errors, but they'll generally do a very good job. And it can be very easy when you're busy to sort of skip that. But that's the fundamental issue here as well. So resist stopping checking. And then the final bit is that within your practice, and we may talk about governance a bit later on, and maybe in response to questions, is that you'll have a process by which people flag issues, prescribing issue, or a safety issue or something like that outside the technology. make sure that people know they can recognize when the things are going wrong and who to speak to. And it's okay to raise this as well. That's the other bit. People sort of sit on it a little bit. Yeah, I would start with all that. I was one other thing in my mind and I've forgotten it. I'll probably come back in a wee second.
Not a problem.
But yeah, you would start with those.
Okay. All right. So we're going to go to some of the questions we've had. We've had a few pre-submitted and we've had quite a lot coming through. So we're going to need to rack through these and stuff. So first one we're going to go to was one that we found from our AI and WhatsApp group. So I believe this is from a guy called Paul. There's lots of existing technology and lots of new and changing technology. How does a practice decide where to focus first? Thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, I'll answer based on the problems that you're facing, and then Yusuf, maybe you pick up on, you know, once you've listed the technologies. But you know, where do you focus first? What is your priority problem? And when I mean your priority problem, like what is genuinely the thing that is keeping you as the senior people in the practice up at night? The thing is, it may be money, it may be risk, it may be patient safety, it may be staff burnout, whatever it is. But the one thing that if someone came around the corner and said, hey, I can solve this, you would rip it out of their hands and you know, implement it as well. So what is your priority problem? And then the next, you know, that's where I would focus my effort in terms of new technologies or technologies that you're wanting to put in place. And now AVT is wonderful, right? But equally, when I speak to practices, it's not the top priority for them. There are some other things too. The difficulty sometimes is that people really like this. So you may want to make a sort of balanced choice. But yeah, my advice to start with is, what is the big priority problem for you as a practice and your patients? Well, Yusuf, what do you think?
Yeah, I agree. I think, you know, we talked a lot about managing risk. And one of the things I think you and I can always violently agree on, Keith, is that focus on doing the thing that reduces the risk the most, right? And that requires expertise. It requires a bit of headspace. It requires a bit of time to sit down and think about it, because it's not just ostensibly on the surface of it, something might seem low risk, but when you start digging into it, the risks start coming out. And I think this is where, again, I go back to this conversation about CSO quality. This is where a good CSO shows themselves compared to someone who maybe doesn't have the breadth of knowledge or experience that's required, because they can see risks that others can't. And, you know, Keith and I have done this in lots of different circumstances. You know, one that comes to mind is tangentially related is when you're looking at, for example, translation services. And often the marker is I'll look at my local population, see what the language spoken is, and I'll go for that language. That's not actually the right metric, because actually what you're looking for is who of those don't speak English. It may be that your local population has got lots of Europeans, and therefore you might believe that English is not their first language, but they have very good command of English and are able to have that conversation. It's actually the small minority that our majority don't have spoken English. And that will come through in a hazard log, right? If you have a patient interface that says, we're going to shift, you know, this interaction from the practice to the digital space, and we're going to tailor it for a language, you need to have that expertise in the room to say, don't just assume that the language you've identified is the right language. You may actually make the problem worse. And so to answer the original question, I think risk is the right way, addressing that risk, but I think it's comfortable to say any CSO can do it, but the right answer is saying you got the right person in the right room to identify and properly assess which products cause the most risk compared to others, because it won't always be evident.
And just to build on that a little bit, you know, we haven't gone into the full detail of what happens to do the safety work, but broadly speaking, there's something called a hazard log, which is a list of how the product works and how it can go wrong and how you stop it going wrong. There's a clinical risk management system and plan, which is how you manage risk, like your governance and how you do it specifically for this. And then the final thing is a safety case report, which is your summing up argument about why it's safe to do this. Anyway, that hazard log gets discussed at something called a hazard workshop. And this is where your knowledge about your practice and your patients and the people that care for them is so important, because you can get, you know, 10 minutes a hazard log that's written for you and it's dished out, and there you know, that's great. But then in your practice, you'll know exactly who's working there and what, you know, something that's a low likelihood and a bit of boilerplate template, actually, because of who you're working with and the patients you're serving, all of a sudden becomes much more important at that point. So the good news is actually you on this call, and you're the experts in your practice and your population. Even a brilliant CSO is not going to know exactly that, which is why you need to have that conversation as well. You know, it's not something that can be just captured once for everyone. There's a little bit at the end, which is where all the risk lies, really, is how does it work specifically at that point? And that difference can be minor or bigger, but it's important to pick that up.
Okay. So we've got about 15 minutes left. We've got loads of cool questions coming through. In fact, Alex has submitted quite a few that we're going to go through. I'm going to go through these relatively quickly, if that's all right, guys. So Alex has put the first one in. In light of the recent paper showing the lack of digital clinical safety, do we know what is the view or plan from CQC?
Oh, over to the lead author, Yusuf Ofskrotchi, who seems so frozen.
I know.
Oh, I don't know. Let's give him a
Such
moment.
a hard question that it caused him to freeze. Okay, so we're going to move on because that's definitely.
We'll come back to that in a second because
we'll come back to that question. Okay,
answering, yeah.
So I'm going to go to her next question if that's all right. So, should insurance be considered where digital maturity is lower?
So I'm just trying to work out, so that insurance where digital maturity is lower, as in, and maybe this is coming back to what we were saying about cybersecurity a moment ago, about whether you'd be more likely to want to bring that in that situation. Hi, Yusuf. We're just going on to another question. We'll come back to the FOI paper in a second. I think it's one of those things that if digital maturity is lower in your area, you may attract a higher premium if it's something that you're wanting to bring in as well. So I refer you back to what I was saying about the practical implementation as well. I think you'd want to make yourself aware of what was available to you and see what was out there. The other aspect of insurance is things like the crown protection and liability and medical indemnity and so on. And when it comes to the use of technologies, actually the indemnity organizations have been picking up the pace quite fast. You know, even a year ago, many of them were unsure or not clear on whether they covered or not. Now I think that's becoming much, much clearer, both centrally, but also from the indemnity organizations, about people operating within the limits of their competence, making sure they're using trusted tools and so on. But it's a relatively easy conversation to have with your indemnifying organization. Yeah, I know that hasn't exactly answered your question there, but I think it's a difficult one to answer because digital maturity can mean a lot of different things.
No problem. We're going to go back to the original one. So this one's for you, Yusuf. In light of the recent paper showing lack of digital clinical safety, do you know what is the view or plan from CQC?
Yeah, thanks for raising that paper up, Alex. It's a nice thing that Keith and I were trying to get in there as well. No, thank you. Yeah, so for those that know, Keith and I did this study, just got released a few weeks ago, showing the dire state of clinical safety compliance among NHS organizations. And to answer your question directly, Alex, I think so the CQC are definitely interested, and as you've seen with the Mythbuster, they are looking at this. I would not be surprised if they use that paper, but also their previous Mythbuster with the AI stuff to start looking at this more generally, which is why this webinar has come live, because we generally think there is a move for the CQC to start taking this on potentially as one of the things they look at during their inspections of primary care organisations, but also NHS trusts. I know, it's no secret, Keith and I have been part of roundtables with the CQC before around exactly this sort of discussion around, how do you help practices become compliant? And then how do you inspect practices to say, okay, what are the things we have to look out for? It needs inspectors to be knowledgeable and able to interrogate this stuff correctly. And it also needs practices staff to be able to talk about it in a confident manner and demonstrate their working. So, internally in Curistica, we have what's the problem, what's the fix, and how do you prove that you've done it? How do you bring the receipts to show that you've done everything that you've said you would?
Yeah, and the important thing, of course, is that the last thing that you want to do is be doing all this work diligently, and then the CQC asks to come and see you. and then you have to spend 2 frantic weeks cobbling everything together and digging it out from it, everywhere else. I mean, the whole point of how we're approaching it, or just a sensible approach, this is making sure that as you're doing the safety work, which is the important bit, let's be honest, is actually doing it, that the evidence of it kind of falls off the side quite easily. And that could be things through your sort of clinical governance meeting notes, about the quality assurance work you do, about your training logs and so on, meaning that, you get your phone call or your email or your message saying they're going to be coming along. And at that point, you don't then have to scramble to put it all into place. What you're really wanting to do, and I'm sure the CQC, or I hope the CQC would agree with this, is that they're just looking for evidence that you've collected anyway, showing that you've done this. People want this to be easy. And we have some thoughts about how to do that fall out of how we engage. And as we find out more, Yusuf and I are nice and open about sharing this, because ultimately care about patient safety, the safety of the people delivering the care to them. Finding ways that we can all do it a bit easier and more effectively is the aim of the game.
Okay, and I can see a couple of people have commented a couple of times that they find this really useful, saying thank you for the event and stuff. Even got a couple of likes, guys. There you go. Ooh, so if people are enjoying this, do let us know. So like it, share it. It'd be great if you can do that, because we think this would be awesome for everybody to know about and stuff. But also it just lets us know that this is useful content, and actually what you want to see next time as well. But we've still got a couple more questions to go, so let's have a look at these. So where are we? Here we are from Nitin Makardia. Would you support a distillation of awareness and basic training within a practice to support the CSO? As you say, it's not the sole responsibility of the CSO. Everyone plays a role.
Yep. Yes. Yeah. Next question. Yeah. No, I suppose we can.
Okay, so yes is a simple answer.
No,
where do you find that level of training? Because we've talked about the CSO. You can go do courses. There's the e-learning for health training. There's the starter point. There's the NHS England training for the full day course and stuff that you ideally should do if you want to be qualified as a CSO. Where's is the intermediate stuff the e-learning for health things, or is it something else?
So, Keith, do you mind if I'll say something quickly? So.
You go for it.
The NHS training is, let's be honest, extremely limited. Okay, and it will tell you how to do it, but when I did it, I did the training. Then I was like, I actually don't know what to do in anger. Like I know what I have to make and how I have to make it and what things I have to think about, but actually doing it in anger is very different. And Keith and I have been very. We've talked about this, about actually the training doesn't prepare you to be a good CSO. It gives you the foundations. But what you really need is some supervision, some help to guide you through that first one, just to hopes. And one of the things we've been trying to do, and we offer this service, is say, look, we're happy to be your CSO, but actually would be thrilled if you have your own CSO and we can support them and supervise them so they actually become self-sufficient. Because again, goes back to our ethos. We want a thing to be safe for everyone, and the best way to do it is for it to be in-house and accessible all the time. Yeah. So we would much rather support you in developing your own CSO than you hiring us as your CSO, because that just creates in the system and improves best practice.
Yeah, and it's maybe important. Like actually, we have been doing this, and shout out to the Wilmslow Health Centre with Amar and Fari and Ayaz, and Fari and Ayaz working as CSOs, and the work that we did there initially for getting Heidi that we're putting out in that particular place. They are the CSOs, and so the work that we did was alongside them, and they, we worked together. They observed and have now picked up things and can ask questions afterwards. And I think that's a really excellent model for it as well. And the CSO training is a little bit like getting a provisional driving license. It allows you to go out on the road, but then you want to make sure that you're picking it up all right along the way. And I think that's a great model for it. I think within Nitin's question was also, well, how do I cascade it further as well? And there are sort of 2 ways in which that happens. A common way in which it happens is that at the hazard workshop. And when I do hazard workshops, I know, Yusuf, I'm sure you find this the same as well. The first part of the hazard workshop, which is a meeting where you step through the hazard log and talk about things, actually is an introduction to clinical safety. You explain everything. And, we start thinking about, well, maybe we should send some materials out first of all and recordings and so on. And within that, I think, is we've also been asked about how do I cascade this further, either to manufacturers, you're working with a manufacturer and they've got people working throughout the organization who think that clinical safety is somewhere else, but they have something to contribute. Or in a practice, it'll be all the members of staff. Now, they don't need to know the exact detail all the way to the bottom, but the principles of what you're trying to do and why the training is important and why they have an important part to play in this, I think could be boiled down into something quite simple. And actually, you raising this point, I suppose, raises things that you and I have talked about before, is about materials to share with practices that can go more widely. But avoiding the dreaded mandatory training tar pit. How do you get it right? And some of those have been things like protected learning time. We've done some of those too.
Definitely. So people were talking about resources. So if people do want some resources, there's some that Keith and Yusuf have provided. So I've put the links to that in the comments down below. There's also, some of you probably noticed, a QR code that's come up that's here or that way, depending on which orientation you're looking at us and stuff. And, there's the short link if you want to access them as well. Directly on the website, and I'll put this underneath the YouTube description and all that kind of stuff if you want to.
I think the other thing to say is that this link sort of comes and talks specifically about some of the services that we at Curistica do. There's a declaration of interest in there.
Yeah.
Actually, providing those links that we've talked about, they've got some other useful links as well. And I think what might be helpful is, bear with us, we can adapt that landing page to have a little bit more information for you. So you may have to bear with us a moment on that.
Sure. And I guess, random LinkedIn user, unfortunately, doesn't give me your name and stuff. Absolutely right approach. Teach a woman/man to fish and support the folk to do the first one. There is absolutely something about having a community of practice out there to help CSOs and to help the rest of primary care to understand this tech in primary care aspects, because, it is a growing area. It's a challenging area that many people look at. And like both of you mentioned, sometimes people just look and think, someone else has done it, it'll be fine. Maybe, but not guaranteed. Do you really want to get it wrong? Probably not. Yeah. Hopefully not.
I would say that's not the correct strategy, but it is a very common one.
Yes. And I liken it to when you prescribe a med. At the end of the day, when you're using medication, loads of meds we use regularly and frequently, but if you use it for the wrong patient in the wrong situation, it's going to be a problem, either for that patient or for yourself in some other way. So you need to make sure you're using it correctly, and you still need that governance and oversight to make sure that when you are using it, you're using it for the right reasons and in the right way. That's the best analogy I think I can think of for primary care.
Actually, funnily enough, yesterday I was at an event and I was talking about a similar analogy, and someone extended it beautifully. It was the Faculty of Pharmaceutical Medicine, and they said, yes, but remember, when you're prescribing, you're not the sole control, as in you do all your work to make sure you prescribe the next thing. But then there's a pharmacist at the other end dispensing it, and they check things. And I'm sure everyone here has had some mistake picked up by a observant pharmacist and so on. And what I think that illustrates beautifully is why it's something for everyone to play their part in. And it's important that we see problems, if problems happen, and they will happen, that it's not wrong to raise an issue. You're not causing trouble. You're playing your part in this chain. That is the insurance policy that we've been talking about earlier on here. And it's going to take a minute to get to that. But, with every successful person that we recruit to this, things get safer and easier.
And just to add to that, we have this multidisciplinary approach in healthcare anyway. And in Curistica, we've internalized that as the clinical safety NDT. So we try not to run a hazard workshop unless lots of people are there. And, that's because other users of the same technology will see how it fails in their space, which might be blind to someone else. And that safety chain is so important. We take the same concepts. We've solved a lot of these problems already in clinical practice. It's now, or at least gone a long way to solving them. It's just a matter of applying it in a digital clinical space as well. If you want to learn more about the clinical safety NDT, ping us a message.
Definitely. So if you do want to contact these guys, then absolutely do so. You know, the QR code's back on there. As I said, the short links and stuff will be down below, and we've put them in the chat as well. As ever, EGP Learning is here to help support you in any way you want. Loads of information. There's lots of content available around some of this. One of the ones you might want to check out if you've been watching this live stream is the recent post we did about how to understand ABT in practice based off the Wandsworth guidance, which I know both of you have read and saw from Devin.
Devin's incredible guidance. Yeah, another fantastic CSO sharing good knowledge.
Absolutely. So if you want to check that out, have a look here, depending on where you're looking at the screen, and absolutely be able to check out that stream. And as always, we'll be here to tech enhance your primary care and learning. We'll catch you next episode. See you later.